starting with attunement. Well, speaking of attunement, on page 171, at the top of the page, it says, as a kind of attunement adequate for such methodological requirements, we shall take the phenomenon of angst as the basis of analysis. The elaboration of this fundamental kind of attunement and the ontological, the fundamentality, if you want, of angst as attunement would correspond to the fundamentality of care in the constitution of Dasein, and especially in today's reading, the being toward death. These are all, as it were, facets of the same fundamental structure of Dasein. The elaboration of fundamental kind of attunement and ontological characteristics of what is disclosed in it as such take their point of departure from the phenomenon of entanglement and distinguish angst from the related phenomenon of fear analyzed earlier. As a possibility of being of Dasein, together with the Dasein itself disclosed in it, angst provides the phenomenal basis for explicitly grasping the primordial totality of being of Dasein. Its being reveals itself as care. Now, he actually elaborates, this is last time's assignment, right? He actually elaborates what he's just said here at great length, as it turns out, in today's assignment. And so that leads me to say, because I'm going to say it when we get to today's assignment, I'm going to say it here. I assume, I didn't in this particular passage check the German for totality, but I assume it's Ganzheit, which it is certainly in today's reading, which I was very careful to look at. And the reason I'm making that kind of distinction is because I think it's certainly in English. Totality suggests precisely the kind of totality that Heidegger wants to get beyond, in the sense that it does suggest a kind of Kantian-like addition, going from oneness, manyness to a totalizing type thing. And I don't think that's so. In that sense, maybe not the best translation of the notion of. I think what he's really driving at is a wholeness. The wholeness.
Ganzheit is whole.
Yeah. But it's translated in this translation. You never get a perfect translation in that regard, right? The other one has certain virtues. This one has. Yes, that's right. So wholeness is where he's at, and the issue with being toward death, therefore, is an issue of the wholeness of Dasein, right? Not its totality in the logical or ontic sense of the word, which I think he makes pretty clear in any event in today's assignment. All right. The ontological, so its being reveals itself as care. The ontological development of this fundamental existential phenomenon demands that we differentiate it from phenomena which at first might seem to be identified with care. Such phenomena are will, wish, predilection, urge, and urge. Care cannot be derived from them because they are themselves founded upon it. In fact, I think, as I'm reading this, I think we already did this in class, this passage, didn't we? At the time that we did it the first time, I was pointing out, notice then that this level of attunement and angst, and attunement in general, is prior to or beneath, deeper than, if you want, the level of wish or will and so forth. So we're beyond, or beyond. We're pre what I was calling last time, I think, a predeterminate analysis or a predeterminate awareness. Attunement and understanding would be this predeterminate ways of, pardon, want of a better language, I was going to say understanding. Let me say attunement and understanding would be, as Heidegger understands it, would be predeterminate ways of speaking of what, in a determinate metaphysical, modern metaphysical sense, we would be talking about in Kant as sensible intuition and understanding in the sense of conceptual, I can say abstract understanding. Like any ontological analysis, the ontological interpretation of Dasein is care, with whatever can be gained from the interpretation is far removed from what is accessible to the pre-ontological understanding of being, or even to our ontic acquaintance with beings. All All right, over on the next page, he says on page 172, in the top paragraph beginning on that page, beings are, independently of the experience, cognition, and comprehension through which they are disclosed, discovered, and determined. But being, all right, so the distinction he's making here now, it's the famous ontological difference, top page 172, between beings and being. So beings are, independently of the experience, cognition, and comprehension through which they are disclosed, discovered, and determined, but being is only in the understanding of that being to whose being something like an understanding of being belongs. Thus, being can be unconceptualized, but it is never completely uncomprehended. In ontological problematics, being and truth have been brought together since ancient times, if not even identified. This documents the necessary connection of being and understanding, although perhaps concealed in its primordial grounds. Thus, for an adequate preparation of the question of being, we need an ontological clarification of the phenomenon of truth. And I think we've kind of said it, and again, it's very much at the center of today's assignment. Truth is discovery and disclosedness, and truth is really, I want to say, probably truth is something. I want to say it's something that Dasein does, right? That is, and so he spends a lot of time distinguishing it from the epistemological understanding of truth as adequation or agreement, I think is the term that's used here in the text. An agreement between a statement and the being that it refers to, in which the point he makes is that what comes to be there is that both the judgment and that which it is a judgment about come to be taken as things objectively present, right? And his main point throughout here is that, in my language, that's going way too fast, right? It skips over, it passes over, I think is the way he puts it. It passes over this primordial, predeterminate, predeterminate, I don't know, that's not even adequate. It's not only predeterminate, it's pre-indeterminate, right? That's what I'm trying to articulate there. A level of understanding, or mode of understanding, perhaps. All right. So angst is the, in the bottom of 172 there, he says, one possibility of being of Dasein is to give ontic information about itself as a being. Such information is possible only in the disclosedness belonging to Dasein, which is based on attunement and understanding. To what extent is angst a distinctive attunement? And then in the next paragraph, with the intention of penetrating to the being of the totality of the structural whole, we might say to the wholeness of the structural whole, we shall take our point of departure from the concrete analysis of entanglement carried out in the last chapter. The absorption of Dasein in the they and in the world taken care of reveals something like a flight of Dasein from itself as an authentic potentiality for being itself. So Dasein is, as again, in today's assignment in particular, Dasein is a kind of uncanniness. Dasein is a not being at home in the world, although initially and for the most part, all right, it is unaware of that, right? In other words, it needs to be the call of conscience. It needs to be called from its being lost in the they, in everydayness. And as we'll see when we get to it in today's assignment, the question is who's doing the calling, and what is as it were, the content of the call. Well, the content of the call turns out to be nothing, nothing worldly. I think it more closely specifies. And who's doing the calling? Dasein is calling itself, but it's calling itself in the mode of silence. It's calling. I think we could say that what Dasein, the call of consciousness, Dasein calls itself, calls to its own attention, right? It's the uncanniness of its being in the world, right? All right. So in the meantime, initially and for the most part, to use his way of speaking, Dasein is in the mode of a flight from itself as an authentic potentiality for being itself. And Angst, of course, is that preeminent or eminent mode of attunement because it is that mode of attunement which awakens Dasein from its state of being lost, from its flight from itself. In this flight at the top at 173 in the second line, Dasein precisely does not bring itself before itself. In accordance with its own most trait of entanglement, this turning away leads away from Dasein. But in investigating such phenomenon, our inquiry must guard against conflating ontic-existential characteristics with ontological existential interpretation, and must not overlook the positive phenomenal foundations provided for this interpretation by such a characterization. It is true that existentially the authenticity of being itself is closed off and repressed in entanglement, but this closing off is only the privation of a disclosedness which reveals itself phenomenally in the fact that the flight of Dasein is a flight from itself. That from which Dasein flees is precisely what Dasein comes up behind. Only because Dasein is ontologically and essentially brought before itself by the disclosedness belonging to it, can it flee from that from which it flees. Of course, in this entangled turning away, that from which it flees is not grasped, nor is it experienced in the turning toward it, but in turning away from it, it is there, disclosed, on account of its character of being, and it can be there, disclosed, precisely in that turning away. It can be disclosed precisely because it isn't an objective presence. It isn't something, you say, any more than Dasein is an inner worldly being, right? Dasein is not objectively present either. Put it that way. It's not really an either or. Which lies in turning away. That from which Dasein flees can be understood and conceptualized by turning toward in a way which is phenomenologically interpretive. All right. And the other, I think we also touched on this on the passage on page 175.
Actually, I do have a question.
Yes, okay.
There's something I have difficulties conceptualizing.
Okay.
What you just read, but in turning away from it, it is there, disclosed.
Right.
Now, this is something that the Dasein is not aware of. The Dasein is not aware that it has turned away, that is lost in the...
Well, I think it depends on we got to get which direction we're turning here. Let's back up a little bit. Only because Dasein is ontologically and essentially brought before itself by the disclosedness belonging, can it flee from that which it flees. Of course, in this entangled turning away, that from which it flees is not grasped, nor is it experienced in the turning toward it, but in turning away from it, it is there disclosed. So it's fleeing itself. Dasein is fleeing itself. That is, it's fleeing what he develops in today's assignment. It's the uncanniness of its being in the world. It flees from itself because that is its authentic, that's the authentic mode of its being in the world, is the uncanniness of it. But it loses that uncanniness in fleeing from itself, turning away from itself, becoming lost in everydayness. Okay? In that turning away from itself,
it is there.
Yeah, right. But in turning away from it, it is there. It is disclosed. In other words,
what is disclosed?
What it's fleeing from.
Dasein?
Yeah, right. Right. Dasein, I would say Dasein in its authenticity is what it's fleeing from. Right? In other words, it.
See that.
Okay. So.
Okay. No. I think it's getting clarified for me.
Right.
What is being disclosed is what is being freed from, which is Dasein in its authentic form.
Right, right. It's being freed from in the lostness in the everyday or in the they, in the flight from itself, right? But the flight from itself, insofar as it is a turning away from itself, is the disclosure of. I don't think he speaks this way, but maybe he might speak this way. He could speak this way because he speaks of truth. I was going to say the truth of Dasein, right? Dasein flees from the truth of its own being in the world, which takes the form of a not being at home in the world, of an uncanniness. And so I'm more if I just put it in everyday terms, which I think is fair to do here. I'm very comfortable if I'm very busy, and I don't reflect upon how weird it is. What are we doing here, right? I mean, really, this is very weird. But we're so used to it because ever since we remember, we've been walking around with these bodies, and you look like I do, and so if I were so this goes to the thing. If I were all alone, it'd be weird. So I can excuse the weirdness of my being this so-called rational animal in Aristotelian terms. It's weird. But since you're one too, right? There's the they. See. Mm-hmm. Since I can relieve myself of the angst, the sense of uncanniness of being in the world by. It can't be that big a deal because I'm surrounded with a lot of other weird creatures. You see, weird Daseins. I think that's the thrust of it, right? So and so as long as I do that, as long as I get lost in the they, as long as the subject of the Dasein that I am is they, all right, and it's not, as he emphasizes. I think in last time's assignment, and again, especially today, as to the extent to which the Dasein that I am is not individuated, right? Then I'm in flight for myself. So angst and the being toward death, those are modes of Dasein in which Dasein now comes to be authentically, but in coming to be authentically, I become, what is the, so the German would be what, Einzelt? No. Einzel? Okay. Yeah, well, variations of that he uses in the German. So it's that, it's almost, I think it must be the German analog of Kierkegaard's Enkelta. I think etymologically it looks that way to me. It's the notion of the singleness, and it has that notion of solitude. In fact, he uses somewhere here. Okay, good. 176. Since we're on this.
I'm confused, so
okay.
If we can come back to that.
Well, I don't think we're going to really leave it.
Okay. Yeah, all right.
On 176 there, in the second paragraph beginning on 176, he says at the end of the fourth line in italics, the existential identity of disclosing and what is disclosed, so that in what is disclosed the world is disclosed as world, as being individualized, pure, thrown potentiality for being, makes it clear that with the phenomenon of angst, a distinctive kind of attunement has become the theme of our interpretation. Angst individualizes and thus discloses. Wer einzelt is what I have here for individuates Dasein. Wer einzelt? Wer einzelt?
Wer einzelt.
Yeah, well, I'm not doing.
Words.
No, I have one word in his text. Okay, yeah, okay. All right. So, but the point is that in the German, that's the ein, it's the singleness, as opposed to the Latinate individual. Okay? So, as I think I pointed out to you, Altheiser likes to emphasize how indebted Heidegger is to Kierkegaard. But what he's done with Kierkegaard is very deep, in the sense that what he's Kierkegaard in some sense remains even only in the mode of a kind of pure negativity. His Kierkegaardian existentialism doesn't go beyond an absurd and total rejection of, I guess you could almost say, the realm of objective presence and the realm of metaphysics and the uncritical ontology of Hegel. Kierkegaard doesn't attempt to explore what Hegel is too quickly. I'm using Hegel now because it's relevant, but Hegel is just the culmination of the whole problem from a Heideggerian point of view. Kierkegaard he is not Heidegger, right? But on the other hand, he frees himself in some sense by being willing to opt for the absurd faith that is altogether, as I was emphasizing when we were doing Kierkegaard in here in some context or another, it's not only apart from reason, it's in opposition to reason, right? There's a fundamental, absolutely, I want to say, positive incompatibility between what Kierkegaard is saying about the single individual, which he can only say on the grounds of a completely anti-rational faith. There's a complete absolute positive incompatibility. So in that sense, you see, that's the opening in a way for Heidegger. I mean, what I mean to say is that he takes that singleness, that Kierkegaardian single individuality, but now, and this is kind of ironic, instead of simply staying with it as Kierkegaard does over against absolute reason, what Heidegger's doing, and he says it somewhere in today's reading very nicely when he talks about the not, he's talking about negation. I don't know whether he doesn't use the word Hegel, but he's talking about Hegel, right? Okay. And when I said one way of getting a handle on where Heidegger's at, since we're all good Hegelians, whether we like it or not, if Hegel starts with the universal, then we go to the particular, then we go to the individual in the Latinate sense, not dividui, right? And I said for openness in here that Heidegger, I understand Heidegger to be a guy who just ain't going anywhere past that first moment, right? That's the moment of what otherwise in a Hegelian world is an indistinguishable being nothing, you see, and what predeterminate in that sense, in a Hegelian sense. Whereas what he's doing, and so that, okay, so that helps because of the totality idea, see? So in other words, that universal moment, which is then particularized and then individuated in Hegel, that universal is not a totality, it is some kind of wholeness, you see? And it's a wholeness which is not an alternative to finitude. That was the first point I made, right? In other words, so that the finite. So in today's assignment, he speaking of again. He doesn't use. He's very careful not to bring Husserl in explicitly, but he poo-poos the whole idea of a pure ego and consciousness in general. All right. So I hope Husserl wasn't paying any attention to him at that point, right? But so you say to yourself, well, wait a minute. I understand. I kind of understand. By now, I kind of understand why you're doing that. But if we're not going to be talking about consciousness in general, what are we talking about, right? Now, we can't be talking quite about consciousness, I want to say specifically, at least not in the, I'm using Hegel now as a shorthand, not in the Hegelian sense, not in a metaphysical sense, right? Not in that sense. So what is a consciousness or an awareness that is not consciousness in general, that is not an abstract consciousness, you see, that is an understanding, really, all right, which is attuned, that is, which is situated in the right. So, in other words, here's what I'm trying to get at. Normally, if I were just speaking in Hegelian-like language, or in the language of the tradition of the history of philosophy, as it turns out, I would just I was going to say, well, not consciousness in general. Then especially Leahy would be inclined to do this and say, oh, not in general, good. That's what we want. We want a specific consciousness. because that's where the thinking now occurring is at. But that's not what Heidegger is at, right? So when he talks about not consciousness in general, he's not going to what I might call a specific consciousness, right? But he's going to the analog of that, the predetermined analog of that, which is a situated consciousness. You see, an attuned understanding, right? That is involved in a world of relevance. You see, and which is involved in the world of relevance because it is itself the Dasein, which is this attuned understanding, is the for the sake of which, all right, things. There is a world of relevance, right? Okay, so let me see. Oh, so I just want to go, and then I'll come back to. So the next, after the italic phrase, Angst individualizes and thus discloses Dasein as solus ipse. That's where I was going. All right. So this singularity, which should remind us, at least for openness, it reminds us of Kierkegaard. You see, the solitude, the singleness, the isolation, you might even say, of the individual. That isolation is brought about by angst, right? Just as it is, in fact, brought about by an authentic relationship to death, a being toward death. Because, as he says in very pedestrian terms in today's assignment, no one can die for you, right? Everyone does their own dying, right? And in that sense, in a Heideggerian sense, I don't know if it was you or me. I don't know who did.
It was me.
Okay. So then I am in this sense individuated or singled. I don't know. We need to invent an English word here. Singlified, right? But in this sense of solus ipsus. I like the term ipse because it's that issue that we were discussing about identity. Okay, and now I don't say this is Heidegger, but at least we're on the same track. In other words, that notion of a solitary identity is what he's talking about. So death is a non-relational, right, possibility of Dasein. As he says later on in today's text, and okay, I want to say something about that, but I won't say it now. So this existential solipsism, however, is so far from transposing an isolated subject thing into the harmless vacuum of a worldless occurrence that it brings Dasein in an extreme sense precisely before its world as world, and thus itself before itself as being in the world. So as I'm reading that, I mean, so many levels here of what he's doing here, right? You said going deeper and deeper, but I want to. So he's going deeper, but in order to appreciate how deep he's going, we need to understand that, really he's deepening. He's attempting to deepen the whole tradition. But what I want to say most particularly, think of Descartes. I mean, in other words, here is Descartes in isolation, but he's in isolation methodologically. He's doubting, and he's got a methodological doubt. He's got a methodological certitude, and so forth. He's kind of superficially, right, articulating what consciousness is, right, passing over, right. So in other words, the ultimate truth of Descartes' project, is his being in the world, right, which he's completely passed over. So he's really, but it's. I want to say it's really nice because it seems to me it's very nice because what we're really talking about here at Dasein, in some sense, is being human. And one of the things that Descartes says in this totally superficial way, relatively speaking to Heidegger, superficial way, is that he makes a big point of the fact that what he does in the meditations, he does as a mere man, by which he means a human being. All right, so he understands that he's doing something that is universally Descartes, universally accessible to any human being who took the time to do the exercise, right? So there's nothing, I want to say, there's nothing specific, according to Descartes, there's nothing specific to him, right? But the irony is What's not specific, it's not a specific talent of his that he can do the meditations. That's what Descartes wants to insist on. You say, oh, he's putting me on. He doesn't mean that. But he does mean it. Okay? And so it's a universal potentiality of all human beings to be able to do the cogito. Okay? But notice, we'll come back to Heidegger, but the universal potentiality of all human beings to do the Cartesian cogito, if anybody does it, and he has a little dialogue, by the way, speaking of the Greeks, Descartes has a dialogue, I forget the name of it, where he interviews a slave and he proves that he leads the slave to do the meditation, right? In a short, quick way, right? Just to prove in the dialogue that anybody can do this, right? What was I going to say? But notice now, it's universally the case that anybody can do the cogito, according to Descartes. So it's not specific to him, I say. Okay. On the other hand, anyone who does it, including Descartes or the slave, when they do it, they're all alone. They're isolated, right? In other words, Descartes, so in other words, it's the universe. So Descartes is just blocked out the angst level here. You understand, right? But the formal structure of it, do you see what I'm saying? The formal structure of it is what Heidegger is saying that this ought to give you some pause, right? That you can do the cogito. In fact, I think somewhere we've got so many different things he does here on page. I won't jump over it because I note that on page 195. We don't have to go there. 195, he actually takes up the sum cogito, and that's the way he takes it up. In other words, instead of cogito ergo sum, instead of I think, therefore I am, he reverses it. The sum, the I am comes before the I thinking, but he means not just linearly in a linear way before, right? But before in this fundamental ontological sense, right? But that's what he's doing. So he's really deepening. To go back to your idea, he's really deepening the whole tradition, and in a way he's faithful to Husserl because Husserl, in a narrower way, does his Cartesian meditations and his whole phenomenological enterprise in order to more perfectly clarify the possibility of knowing that Descartes was embarked on initially, right? I think it would not be right to say that Heidegger is doing what he's doing for the sake of clarifying the scientific methodology, but the whole how can I put it, the whole being, probably a philosophy. I think I made a better way to put it than. But what I'm getting at is that he has the same kind of, in his own way, different than Husserl, his own kind of clarifying project. The clarification, however, going back going back by the reversal of the sum and the cogito, going back before the cogito. I'm using cogito as a comprehensive index of all of the thinking of the tradition, all right? Of all thinking in that sense.
But not including the Greeks, or including the Greeks.
I think including the Greeks, although it's a little, it's not quite as clear cut when you get to the Greeks. The Aristotle passage, I think, indicates that in today's reading, where he makes the distinction between noesis and dianoia, and associates, which I think he's already done, or I did. I don't know whether he did it or I did it initially in the earlier part of the text, but it comes to the same thing. Associating aesthesis and noesis, that is, associating in the Greek world aesthesis, perception, sensation, perhaps, depending on the context, associating that with, but certainly perception would be an easy way to do it, with noesis, that is, Heidegger acknowledging, pointing out that for Aristotle, and he might have said for Plato, to know, noesis, the act of knowing, is the analog of perception in what we would call a physical sense, right? So, to that extent, that is, to the extent to which Aristotle, and I would say, I don't think he says, but I would say Plato too, to the extent to which they understand what it means to understand, at least on the analogy to perceiving, to say, then they would be less, I don't know, less guilty? Less guilty. Less explicitly guilty than the moderns, right? In other words, it's simple. I mean, it's not simple, but it's a truism that what Descartes does in the Meditations, the whole problem is that he starts off with a totally disembodied consciousness. And then, now of course he wants to establish, on the basis of this consciousness, he wants to be able to establish its unity with the world and the body and the corporeal res extensa and so forth and so on, right? But he makes that split. Now, if you think of Aristotle never did and never would. It would never even occur to Aristotle to make such a split between the soul, the so-called Cartesian soul or consciousness, the purely formal, immaterial res cogitans, and the res extensa. For Aristotle, the form of the body, the consciousness, the soul, is the form of the body. You understand? It's the form of the body. It's not a form that exists independently of the body. Now, of course, where would you ever get the idea that the soul could exist independently of the body? Well, you might get it if you were a Christian theologian, you see. And so, in today's assignment, he makes the point that I mentioned already, the pure consciousness, the pure ego, and the consciousness in general are hangovers from Christian theology. You see? Okay, so to go back to your question, you know already, you already know formally that therefore the problem that he's dealing with was exacerbated in modernity thanks to Christian theology, and therefore, relatively speaking, not altogether now, but relatively speaking, the metaphysical tradition in the Greek world would not be, relatively speaking, would not be as completely, again, I don't want to go to the culpable or whatever you want to say, right? Completely off base, because there is some, right, and that there is no difference between there's no possibility of separating the soul and the body of which it is the form in Aristotle, right? Is kind of an easy, I think, marker of that, or kind of easy evidence of that fact. I just want to give Nancy a chance, because she has.
I just want to make a comment, sort of a question, and that is that I think about the Greeks and then Descartes, and one of the big differences for me, I don't know if I'm right about this, is they look at this kind of problem in the third person and Descartes in the first person. Right.
Well, that's part of it, yeah.
So I have the sense that Heidegger is in some way neither. I mean, I don't know.
Right.
You know.
Well, go on. I mean, I didn't mean to cut you off.
But my question was something else. But I just, there's some way in which that polarization, choosing one side of that polarization or the other is not what's happening here.
Well, I was struck by this flipping of Descartes. Dasein is being ahead of itself.
Where are you?
Well, I'm jumping at 231, but I mean, it's all over.
Okay,
it's all over
all right.
But being ahead of itself,
right?
At least in terms of syntax, is exactly what he's doing with I think, therefore I am. I think.
You say that Descartes is
that Heidegger,
right,
in saying that Dasein,
right,
the fundamental characteristics of the being of Dasein are expressed in, first thing is, in being ahead of itself.
Okay.
Hyphenated, right?
Okay.
So on some level,
right,
at least syntactically, that's the flipping of I think, therefore I am.
Okay. Let me see. I'm going to see if I follow you exactly. Okay. Yeah. All right. How did you put it? Syntactically? Yeah. Formally. Yeah, I think there's probably something to that. Yeah. Okay.
Let me just quick ask my question, which was back on 170.
170.
171, where we started.
Okay.
And it has to do with, here's what I still don't quite understand, that being lost
Mm-hmm.
is a turning away from.
All right. Okay.
So what I'm confused about is how disclosure happens in being lost.
Angst.
But angst is being lost always accompanied by angst, or it's only when angst, in a sense, is there that something is disclosed?
Well, I think I want to just take advantage of what you just said about the however you phrase it, the ego and the first person versus.
Yeah.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I don't think it's an alternative.
Okay.
Right. In other words.
Okay.
And that's why, right? And that's why he says the turning away, the flight, Dasein's flight from itself is a being there. It's disclosed in, right? In other words, in fleeing from itself, it discloses itself. Right? In other words,
It bears itself. It makes it.
It's
appear.
yeah. It reminds me a little bit. It's a little more sharply analogous. It's analogous to a more sharply defined idea in, which I think you could say Sartre is drawing on Heidegger here in some way. The notion in Sartre of bad faith, right? The bad faith. The subject, the person lies to themselves. Sartre says, well,
Okay, that helps.
wait a minute, if you're lying to yourself, then you must know the truth,
Yes.
right? Otherwise you're not lying. If I tell you something that's false, and I don't know any better, I'm not lying to you, I'm just it's false. But bad faith is, according to Sartre, the person lying to themselves. Well, wait a minute, how can you lie to yourself successfully? I mean, you know the truth, right? All right, well, whatever that
Yeah, I got it.
hang up, whatever that, right? So you can deceive yourself. But now, here's the point. I think that goes to where your question is. As in the case of Sartre's notion of bad faith, you can only do this so long. Okay.
I got it. Okay.
You see, in other words, so one form of your angst would be your forgetfulness. You're losing yourself, right? That would be a form of your angst, which in which the angst is covered over, covers itself over. Dasein covers itself. It's authentic being, right? We don't have a third part. Speaking of third parties, right? In other words, we don't have a third party here. That's right. So.
I see.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think I was thinking of the being lost as some kind of total unconsciousness, forgetting that what we're talking about is the nature of Dasein.
Yeah.
Which include, yeah, I got it.
Yeah. So initially, for the most part, Dasein is lost in the world, so to speak. But in other words, it's not accidentally
Yes.
initially and for the most part lost. By which I mean to say the flip side of its being accidentally so would be that, well, maybe it'll never come out of it.
Right.
It's constitutionally initially and for the most part lost, which means that it's going to come out of it, right? It's going to have the occasion of angst in the sense which I think you were pointing to, right?
Yeah.
Where it's discomfort, it's deep fundamental discomfort in being in the world surfaces, as it were.
Right. So here's a question, just
Okay.
quickly to go with
Yeah.
that. So there's kind of a moral, I mean, not kind of, a strong moral tinge to Sartre's version of this, but not Heidegger's.
Well, that's a point that Waltraut was making on another issue analogous to that. Yeah, because he wants to he wants to describe this as what he would call an existential and ontological structure of Dasein. And I think what we're talking about here is that the moral would be an existential, would apply to the existential being Dasein, right? I think so in that sense. So, yes, but I think that's right. I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, that's fine.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. 179.
David,
Yes.
Before we
Oh,
do
yeah.
176,
Okay.
I just want to make sure that the movement from solus ipse that we were talking about earlier to being in the world, just in terms of the words here, we're moving from Dasein as disclosed as solus ipse.
Okay. Well, Angst individualizes and thus discloses.
Right.
Right.
And obviously, this is not solipsism the way it's normally defined.
No, that's why he puts it in quotes. Right.
And so the solus ipse discloses Dasein, and obviously to disclose Dasein is to show being in the world, to show that it is being in the world.
I think so. It's not this existential solipsism is so far from transposing an isolated subject thing into a harmless vacuum of wordless occurrence that it brings Dasein in an extreme sense precisely before its world as world, which I think is what you just said in effect,
yes.
right?
Yeah. What struck me about this is that normally when we think of solipsism, or when I think of solipsism, it wouldn't be as he has here in between the commas. It's not so much that an isolated subject thing into the harmless vacuum of a wordless occurrence, but the possibility that there is no world, there is no. Oh wait, maybe that is what worldless means. There is no vacuum. There is no container in which the subject thing exists. In other words, solipsism is precisely the expansion of that subject thing to an all-encompassing space. There is no container around it, right?
Okay, so I think he, in effect, at least substantively in effect, he's really saying here what I was saying spontaneously about the analog between his deeper understanding of what is suggested, maybe because Heidegger has given us the possibility of seeing it, when we look at Descartes. So Descartes' consciousness is this isolated. Descartes' problem is he a solipsist? That's his problem, right? And so he wants to overcome his problem, but he starts with that problem, right? So the deeper understanding of the truth, for want of a better term, of solus ipse, of the solitude of Dasein. I want to say of the individual Dasein. That's what he's exploring, and that is, as it were, the ontological structure without which there would be no Descartes, right? There would be no possibility of, I could say, there'd be no possibility of science. There'd be no possibility of psychology. There'd be no possibility of epistemology, right? It's that kind of thing. Okay. What was I going to do? Oh, I want to just go to 179 a moment. The top paragraph in 179, Dasein is a being which is concerned in its being about that being. The is concerned about has become clearer in the constitution of being of understanding as self-projective being toward its own most potentiality for being. This potentiality is that for the sake of which any Dasein is as it is. Dasein has always already compared itself in its being with the possibility of itself. Being free for its own most potentiality for being, and thus for the possibility of authenticity and inauthenticity, shows itself in a primordial elemental concretion in angst. But ontologically, being toward one's own most potentiality for being means that Dasein is always already ahead of itself in its being. Dasein is always already beyond itself, not as a way of behaving toward beings which it is not, but as being toward the potentiality for being which it itself is. And he's in the earlier part of what I read there, in the fifth line, Dasein has always already compared itself with a possibility of itself, all right? So, let me finish this paragraph. So, he says, this structure of the essential being concerned about, we formulate as the being ahead of itself of Dasein. And I wrote in the margin here, when he says Dasein has always already compared itself with a possibility of itself, I wrote beyond itself. The Dasein, Heidegger's Dasein is beyond itself. Now, in the thinking now occurring, especially in the critique of Agamben in the morality seminar, but also on my website, I have a rather impossible logical presentation of beyond X. Okay, and so you could look at that if you have the patience to try and figure that out, but you don't. And don't misunderstand me. I think it's important that I'm able to put that kind of insanity on paper or on the website, because Dogen has a sense of a kind of absolute now, time being, and so forth and so on. And even though I think the historical dimension and the dimension of creation in the sense of creation ex nihilo is it well, I think the historical I haven't found it yet. And
I don't think you will.
Yeah, okay. And if I could find anything like a creation ex nihilo, it would be at least problematic. Okay. But on the point of agreement that there would seem to be with this Buddhist understanding, and again it applies in a kind of complicated way to Heidegger too, right? Because is that Heidegger uses in today's assignment many times, so we'll get to it finally in the text, but here you have it in the form of the head of itself, the notion of the not yet, okay? And Dasein is not yet, it's what it is, what it will be, potentially, right? Okay. So let's see if I can formulate this, the point I want to make. In the thinking now occurring, the not yet is not, and therefore, and now, so the thinking now occurring would distinguish itself from Heidegger, although there are lots of interesting points of similarity. It would, in other words, the not yet comes into the thinking now occurring, but it comes in not as I'm saying in effect here, being ahead of itself is not as being beyond itself. Okay, it's in the thinking now occurring. That cute terminology, I think, is substantive. Beyond X, right? Or so if I just substitute for X here itself, just to get the language lined up. In the thinking now occurring, for want of a better term, Dasein is absolutely not yet. Okay. So in today's assignment, he will say later on, if we get to it in the text, Heidegger will say Dasein not yet belongs to Dasein. You see? So yes, he's got not yet as belonging to Dasein, as an integral part of the wholeness of Dasein. Is it's not yet being what it will be, and that of course is going to relate to being toward death as the extreme not yet of Dasein is it's coming to an end. Right? That's the extreme of it not yet is it's coming to an end. Okay. And so I just want to make this general comment because I want to position this for the larger picture. In Heidegger, authentically, Dasein is oriented toward its coming to an end, oriented authentically toward its death. But unlike the thinking now occurring, it's not yet dead. It's not right. It's not. But when I say that in in the thinking now occurring, Dasein is absolutely not yet. It's being dead is not a potentiality. It's an actuality, which is very liberating, by the way. I think it's more liberating than the freeing that Dasein does for itself here in its being toward death. It frees itself, you see. It does free itself, and it actually goes back to the thing you were struggling with and I was trying to articulate, which is not easy to do, the fact that it's not an either-or. The angst is not an either-or. There's a kind of continual, constitutional, I don't know what going back and forth, so to speak, in the very structure of Dasein, right? But then, in a certain sense, from the perspective of thinking now occurring, then we're hung up in this in Heidegger, right? We're hung up in this being toward death. Let's just die, get it over with, and then we'll be completely free to do what needs to be done, right? It's that kind of difference.
Isn't that what he's trying to say on page 228, the third paragraph?
I look. Do you have a photographic memory? You're very good. You pick out these things. 228.
I definitely do not know.
Okay. Well, then you have an intuitive memory. Where is
The
it?
third
He's
short
moving,
paragraph
he's
down.
moving toward it.
Okay.
Where's it
It's
read?
the third small paragraph on page 220. Rather, just as Dasein constantly already is, it's not yet. As long as it is, it also always already is its end. Isn't that pretty dead?
Just as Dasein constantly already is, it's not yet. As long as it is, it also always already is its end. The ending that we have in view when we speak of death does not signify a being at an end of Dasein, but rather a being toward the end of this being. Death is a way to be that Dasein takes over as soon as it is. As soon as a human being is born, he is old enough to die right away, which I think is a Hegelian quote. Well, I think we need some other passages here. I don't know whether I can do this quickly, but yes, I would say, I don't know whether Jim was being facetious or not, but I think he's moving toward this being dead, but and he's much relative to the everyday way in which Dasein treats death as something that happens to other people, right? Well, in that sense, yes. So relatively speaking, I would say that Dasein in Heidegger is, in its authentic being, it's, relatively speaking, it's dead, right? It's dying, it's, right? But again, going back to the, for want of a better term, the seesawing that's possible here. In other words, another way of putting it is the thinking now occurring, there's no angst. There's no angst. There's no... my deeper thought about this, which I succinctly articulate in the appendix to Faith and Philosophy, is that modernity is, in various forms, the modern thinkers in various forms, although it may not be their explicit project, it becomes an explicit project. And Heidegger, he kind of gives it away, right? But looking back, you can say that all of these guys, in one way or another, are dealing with angst. He's bringing it to the fore. They're dealing with it by repressing it, suppressing it, depending on which thinker we're talking about. Hegel does it by saying there's nothing outside of the absolute idea. Well, then, of course, there's nothing to be concerned about. There's nothing to be, right? The whole reality he's got the whole reality covered. Notice that when Kierkegaard, and this is relevant to the etymology of Heidegger's text, when Kierkegaard puts himself in opposition to Hegel, what is one of the first things that Kierkegaard notices? And one is anxiety. The concept of dread is fundamental to his understanding of what it means to be the existing absolute idea, if I could put it that way, or the existing subjectivity. Yeah. All right. So the question that you're raising, the larger context would be that the only way you can, if the thinking now occurring is truly without angst, that's only possible, and the reason it isn't possible up until now, and explicitly not possible, and importantly, positively not possible in Heidegger, is that the thinking now occurring has absolutely no notion of self. And yes, we don't have a pure ego, and we don't have an everyday ego here, you see, but we still have a selfhood, even if it's a predeterminate selfhood, even if it's the selfhood of the solus ipse, which is in its being toward death, is being toward the possibility of its being non-related, not related, right? To being all alone. It's being all alone, right? Well, loneliness is a form of self-other consciousness. I said to Foldus in one of these emails, only is the only, being alone, is like the spatial analog. I'm trying to remember with the temporal, not being absolutely now. That would be a temporal dimension, right? So in the negative, not being absolutely now would be either past or future. The spatial analog of not being absolutely now, of being beyond X, either not yet or ahead of itself. Right? Yeah. The spatial analog of that is the notion of solace, of solitude, of there being no one else around, quite literally, right? So the thinking now occurring, unlike Dasein, as Heidegger understands Dasein, is not doing it's not making any kind of room. It's not doing any kind of spatializing. It's absolutely now. And so beyond X is existing for the first time absolutely now. And I want to say, I was about to say there is no possibility of angst, but the reason there's no possibility of angst in the thinking now occurring is that there's no possibility of possibility. Okay? There's no possibility. Right? So when he talks about death as the possibility of Dasein's impossibility, which cannot be bypassed and so forth and so on, right? In the thinking now occurring, what we have is the impossibility of impossibility. That's which I think I just said. There's no possibility of the category of possibility. Right? So there's no possibility of death doesn't mean there isn't death, but we're already dead. Right? I don't know how else to put it. I'm not totally satisfied with that, and I want to come back to your question because I think your question is right up to a point, but within the context of what Heidegger is doing, yes, he's trying to say something like that. And what he's saying is important. In other words, within the limits of that. So in other words, remember he said earlier on that Dasein is its past, and its present comes to it from out of its future. And another way, again, becomes important in today's assignment. He's already talked generally about temporality and that being itself is temporal, and now temporality, of course, is a fundamental way of understanding the structure of Dasein, right? Because, but temporality, as Jones Stambaugh makes clear in the little article on you handed that around. Did other people have that on the translation? Yeah. She talks about it in there, and she makes the point that temporality is not, which Heidegger, of course, himself is making, but she highlights it. Temporality for Heidegger, true meaning of temporality in this predeterminate world, using my language, is not a passing of time. All right, it's not a linear temporality, but it is a structure. It's a fundamental structure of Dasein. All right, and as a structure, it makes possible time reckoning in the everyday sense of the word, you see. But structurally, what he's saying is that Dasein is ahead of itself. It's thrown. It's as it were, when it comes to itself, it's already there. Okay, the world is already there. It's already in the world, right? So that it's being ahead of itself, and it's already having, therefore, in some sense, a past, and it's having that past is what it is. It is what has a past, right? And looking in the other direction, as it were, have to be careful here, right? It also has a future, that it has a possibility, it has a potentiality to be itself. So when he talks about the potentiality to be itself, which would be the cause of anxiety, and of course Sartre runs with this when he talks about anguish. What is the French, right? The equivalent of anxiety, of angst. Vertigo. Sartre has a very nice analogous of vertigo, and vertigo is just what happens when you become aware of your freedom, right? Well, freedom as these guys understand it. I don't say as the thinking now occurring understands it, okay? As these guys understand freedom is possibility, okay? And insofar as freedom is possibility, then that suggests on a number of levels impossibility. The impossibility to be any longer have possibilities, and it also suggests in the short range, it also suggests possibility suggests how shall I say, the possibility not to realize oneself, right? Not to be, the possibility not to be oneself, right? Okay. I'll stop there. Do we have?
Is it
okay.
fair to say that Dasein's now is always its past or its future, or its past and its future?
In Heidegger?
For Heidegger.
Yes. Well, I think it's fair to say, I would say, he would say, I don't know whether he used the word present. That's another issue. I mean, these little pedantic things are important. In other words, he speaks of the present. Thinking now occurring never speaks of the present. It speaks of now. It makes a distinction between the present and now. Because if I'm in a Heideggerian understanding of Dasein, then not only am I, as Dasein, my past, with my future, with my being qua possibility coming to me from out of the future, so to speak. But also notice on every level of his analysis, when he talks about, for example, objective presence, right? All right? When he talks about things in the worldly beings and so forth, these things they're not simply objective, but they're present to Dasein. All right, and so I don't think that Heidegger really has a sense in the thinking now occurring sense. I don't think he has a sense of an absolute now, because that would suck up and eliminate the notion of now as the present. And present, you understand what I'm building on here, is the etymology, implicitly the etymology, the prae sum, the being prae sum. If I put it in translated crude English, a pre-I am. Pre-I am. I'm always ahead of myself. You could also, I suppose, say in a certain sense, I'm always, in a certain sense, behind myself. Right? I'm not yet what I will be. Okay, so that distance, whether you look at it temporally, having a past and the future, or spatially, right, confronting things other than Dasein as things that are objectively pre-sum, pre-I am, the Latin prae, from which we get the pre, also has, in the gods were praesentes, they were present, but prae has the connotation there of they were on top. They were above, so to speak. That's interesting. Now I'm saying that. So now I have an understanding of why, again, going back to Heidegger's understanding now, why Heidegger is unhappy with the notion of things objectively present as an adequate understanding of the relationship of Dasein to the things that are at hand in the world. There's a sense in which they can't be present to Dasein authentically, right? In other words, I want to say it's Dasein's world, Dasein worlds here, Dasein truths, Dasein being, not in the plural, in the singular. It bees, it being.
The verb,
yeah, you understand it. All right, so we already mentioned 195. I don't think we'll pause there. Let's go on to today's assignment, and on page 203 or thereabouts. I guess we jumped ahead there. Okay, so go back to 201, 202, 203.
Pages.
Pages 202?
Are you talking about pages here? Yeah.
Translation pages, right.
201?
202, let's start at the bottom of 202. Being true, as discovering, is a manner of being of Dasein. What makes this discovering itself possible must necessarily be called true in a still more primordial sense. The existential and ontological foundations of discovering itself first show the most primordial phenomenon of truth. Discovering is a way of being in the world. Taking care of things, whether in circumspection or in looking in a leisurely way, discovers inner worldly beings. The latter become what is discovered. They are true in a secondary sense. Primarily true, that is, discovering, is Dasein. All right, so I say Dasein truths, right? Dasein discovers in Heidegger's language, and therefore, again, in this active sense, right? Not in a thing-like sense. In an active sense, Dasein is primarily true. Truth in the secondary sense does not mean to be discovering, but to be discovered, discoveredness. That's in the secondary sense. But we showed in our earlier analysis of the worldliness of the world and inner worldly beings that the discoveredness of inner worldly beings is grounded in the disclosedness of the world. However, disclosedness is the basic character of Dasein in accordance with which it's there. Disclosedness is constituted by attunement, understanding, and discourse, and pertains primordially to the world, the being in, and the self. The structure of care as being ahead of itself, already being in a world, as being together with inner worldly beings, contains the disclosedness of Dasein. With and through it is discoveredness. Thus, only with the disclosedness of Dasein is the most primordial phenomenon of truth attained. What was shown earlier with regard to the existential constitution of the there, and in relation to the everyday being of the there, pertains to nothing other than the most primordial phenomenon of truth. In that Dasein essentially is its disclosedness, and as discloses and discovers, it is essentially true. Dasein is in the truth, right? Now here's this also gives me an opportunity to go. I want to go back to Kierkegaard again, because in Kierkegaard I have this sense of the single individual, where that single individual is the incompatible alternative, absolutely incompatible alternative to absolute self-consciousness in the sense of absolute reason, the absolute idea of Hegel, right? So Kierkegaard has the presence of mind, if I can put it that way, which might be literally the case even in terms I was using the word presence before. He has the presence of mind to declare himself in his understanding of faith to be occupying a perfectly, absolutely absurd position, as it were, which is no position, right? Which is 80,000 out over 80,000 fathoms deep, the abyss. Okay, and so that solus ipse in Heidegger is now a kind of grounding, a more primordial grounding of what, in an existential way, from a Heideggerian point of view, is being called is being called to attention by Kierkegaard, right? Now Kierkegaard is still dealing in that theological realm, right? So when we go from the sorry, all right, so let's go back to Husserl as the middle guy here. Kierkegaard, Husserl, Heidegger. This is the order in which they're treated in the last part of Novitas Mundi. Let's do Husserl first. The pure consciousness, the pure ego, the consciousness in general. Okay, that's not primordial enough, right? We got to get down beneath that, right, to a kind of non-general awareness, which I said is an understanding which is equi-primordially attuned to the world, which is situated. Okay, it's going to be situated, however, in a way that's analogous. Now let's go back up to Kierkegaard. Analogous to the particularity of the single individual, right? It's going to be so in Heidegger, and what I'm trying to get at is that critique of Husserl is simultaneously a critique of the well, to use a Heideggerian phrase, which I don't think he uses. I haven't found it yet in rereading this. The onto-theological context in which Kierkegaard speaks of the single individual, right? You know what I'm saying? So
He does use the word onto-theological. He does use it.
Did he use that? Okay.
I think in his reading.
Okay. Well, that's what I want to say anyway. So we want to get beneath the onto-theological to the more primordial experience of Dasein's being in the world, and therefore we want to have a primordial understanding of singleness, right? And a primordial understanding of consciousness or of selfhood. And now here's what I think is the certainly with regard to, I want to say with regard to, it seems to me there should be a parallel to what I'm going to say with regard to Husserl, but let me say it first for Kierkegaard. So therefore, one way of understanding what Heidegger is accomplishing here is he is, see, I want to say, but I can't say it, but this will give you the idea of what I'm trying to get at. I would like to say he's rationalizing Kierkegaard, but of course that's absurd. Kierkegaard doesn't allow for any rationalizing of his position. That's the whole point. Okay, but if you were to do something, say, not rationalizing Kierkegaard, but understanding Kierkegaard primordially. Do you understand? Understanding Kierkegaard's understanding of the singularity, the deeper ontological structure that makes possible Kierkegaard's project.
He's mining.
Yeah, okay. Well, undermining, but he's mining under. It's kind of building the support, ontological support for Kierkegaard's faith. What Kierkegaard understood to be faith. Now, this would be a little bit, I think, although you never know, this might be a little disconcerting to Kierkegaard. But of course, what Heidegger's doing would probably be disconcerting to Husserl. But it's I guess what I want to say in fairness to Heidegger, it's a constructive. It's meant to be, and I think philosophically it is a constructive undermining, right? A deepening. And the price of the deepening, which is the price that he's happy to pay, which is it's not a cost to him. The price of the undermining is the letting go of the world of objective presence and the understanding of thinking as metaphysics. Right? So when we stop thinking metaphysically in the modern sense of the word, and I would say implicitly in a different way, stop thinking metaphysically in the ancient sense of the word. They're different, and therefore the onus on them is slightly different, as we were saying before, in a different context. Nevertheless, when we stop thinking metaphysically, onto-theologically, then that is a constructive undermining of the tradition, and brings us to the point, perhaps, I don't know if the point's the right word here, maybe to the place, which is between that which is being undermined and what we'll see in the next book is the other beginning, right? Which again we anticipate in the future. So go back to the question you raised there on 228. Another fundamental notion that he articulates today is the notion of anticipation, and so wherever we're involved with anticipation, we're not quite dead. That's all I want to say about that. Okay. Let's just take a look at that Aristotle passage on page 207. On the bottom of page 207, he says in the second full paragraph in the bottom of 207, at the same time, we must not overlook the fact that for the Greeks, who are the first to develop this initial understanding of being as a branch of knowledge, and to bring it to dominance, this primordial understanding of truth was also alive, even if pre-ontologically, and even held its own against the concealment implicit in their ontology, at least in Aristotle. Okay, so in other words, there's a certain ambiguity, you see, of the way he's treating the Greeks. In other words, in one way, they maintain some sort of primordial understanding, despite the fact that they're ultimately responsible for the history of philosophy. Okay, but they were not as completely cut off, I would say, from the primordial as modernity is, proximately because of Kierkegaard, Descartes, but penultimately, proximately, because of Christian theology, right? Because I think one of the points we made when we were doing Kierkegaard in here somewhere is Descartes. That's interesting. I do that because Kierkegaard is also a kind of a variation on the subjectivity of Descartes, right? See, so that all these modern guys, Heidegger and Kierkegaard, they're all doing their version, and Hegel's doing his. They're all doing their version of Descartes. They're all doing different dimensions. Must be a musical term for this. You know what I'm talking about. But you have a different whatever. Okay. Huh?
Variations. Yeah.
Variations. Yeah. Variations. Okay. Now what was I going to say? Aristotle. But all right. You could say that we have been brought. So this is the kind of an analogy I'm making, right? As I'm thinking. If Dasein is being toward its end, being toward death, being toward its end, what I was about to say was that modernity is the extremity of something that is begun with the Greeks, right? In other words, Greek ontology is the beginning of a path that leads ultimately to the death of philosophy. That's what I want to say. It leads to the end of philosophy. It leads to its own demise in some sense. Now, I don't know whether Heidegger would be comfortable with this, but it's like Heidegger is, I was going to say, he's rehearsing it. He's rehearsing that death of philosophy in a positive form in the thinking that he's doing. All right. So Aristotle, in the next paragraph on page 207, never defended the thesis that the primordial place of truth is the judgment. Rather, he says that the logos is the kind of being of Dasein which can either discover or cover over. This double possibility is what, I think that was back on 148 and 149, where he was talking about that what he's now referring to as that double possibility. This double possibility is what is distinctive about the truth of the logos. It is the attitude which can also cover over. And since Aristotle never asserted this thesis, he was never in the position of expanding the concept of truth of logos to pure knowing. The truth of eistasis and of the seeing of the ideas is the primordial discovering. All right, so in other words, insofar as Aristotle, he says Aristotle, I think it's true of Plato too. Insofar as Plato and Aristotle understood the substantive analogy, this way I would phrase it, the substantive analogy between aesthesis, perception, and knowing, noesis, knowing, as opposed to thinking, as opposed to the dianoia, the ratio sonata process. Insofar as they had that distinction, then to that extent they were involved with the primordial discovering. Do you see? To the extent that they understood science in terms of the logos, right? In terms of, I would say, episteme. I don't know whether he would use that term here, but insofar as they understood being in scientific terms, that's the way of putting it, right? In terms of their ontology, then to that extent they are the beginning of the history of philosophy, which ultimately comes to an end with the end of in modernity, or at the end of modernity. All right. So the thesis. So he gets Aristotle off the hook here, so to speak. The thesis that the genuine locus of truth is the judgment not only invokes Aristotle unjustly, it also fails with regard to its content to recognize the structure of truth. And on page 208, in the second paragraph, understood in its most primordial sense, truth belongs to the fundamental constitution of Dasein. In the next paragraph, the kind of being of truth and the presupposition of truth, constituted by disclosedness, Dasein is essentially in the truth. Oh, that's another thing I wanted to say, over against Kierkegaard. All right, so now if we say he's undermining Kierkegaard in this constructive sense, philosophically constructive sense, nevertheless, I say Kierkegaard would not be entirely happy, right? Because in Kierkegaard, in the philosophical fragments, the learner, right, who would be existing Dasein, right, is in untruth and comes to be in the truth, only by the intervention of the God. Okay? So the sharp dichotomy there, right? So I guess this is what I was talking about in quotes, Heidegger rationalizing Kierkegaard, which is impossible. Okay, you can't rationalize Kierkegaard literally, but you can understand Kierkegaard, right? Rationalizing him with double quotes. Then what he's doing is substituting for the Kierkegaardian the God, who intervenes and calls the learner. What is the learner in the philosophical fragments? He's lost. He's in Heideggerian terms. He's in some kind of theyness. You see, he is, and so. But in Kierkegaard, the God calls the learner from the right. Whereas he says in today's society, it's very clear that Dasein calls itself. You see, so I want to say, when I say he undermines Kierkegaard, even though philosophically, constructively, he does so in a way that is incompatible with Kierkegaard's self-understanding, if I can put it that way. I mean, not altogether incompatible, you see, but incompatible enough that I think it doesn't square with Kierkegaard's self-understanding. And insofar as he does that, I want to finish my thought. That's the way in which Hegel continues to be operating in Heidegger, right? That's the way in which I say this with a grain of salt, and again with quotation marks, because he puts quotation marks about subjectivity, so I think I can do the same thing here. So we're talking in the same kind of discourse. He, in some sense, is a Hegelian. Okay? Now, he's a Hegelian who's saying to Hegel, wait a minute, don't give me all this jazz about the dialectic with the not, and the double negation and so forth, because you haven't primordially thought through what the not is, right? Okay? But what I'm getting at is that he's not rejecting the not. And in some ways, I think he said elsewhere, he's not really in any unqualified sense rejecting the scientific or philosophical or metaphysical tradition. He's rejecting it precisely insofar as it too hastily passed over the primordial constitution which made it possible. By the way, I don't think made it necessary. That is, made it possible to be, but not necessarily that it had to be in that way. In other words, the notion that truth is a matter of agreement, okay, is made possible by the fact that Dasein is in the truth, you see. But it's not but Dasein's being in the truth doesn't necessarily have to take the form of the traditional notion of truth as agreement. It has taken that form in a kind of misunderstanding, or you might almost say in a kind of flight from itself, right? In a kind of oblivion. I think that'd be another way of putting it in Heideggerian sense, a kind of forgetfulness, kind of an oblivion of its authentic being, right? Which is giving and taking with the same, right? In other words, what has happened intellectually is only possible because of the primordial structure of Dasein. But insofar as it happened, it need not have happened, and in the way in which it happened, it covered over the primordial structure that made it possible. That is, it was not aware of its own deeper possibility. Right? And so the whole intellectual, I think I said this last time in a certain way, the whole history of philosophy is like a big picture version of what you might say in individual Daseins is a being lost in the day, right? It's a right? Yeah, okay. All right, now. Okay, so, all right, so I want to get to the not yet because, well, on the way to that, let's do the presupposing one. On page 209, in the second paragraph on page 209, the second paragraph that begins on 209, the first paragraph that begins on 209. The meaning of the presupposition of truth, too, becomes intelligible in terms of the existentially conceived kind of being of truth. Why must we presuppose that there is truth? What does presuppose mean? What do must and we mean? And later on he's going to say, Dasein presupposes itself. What do must and we mean? What does it mean there is truth? We presupposes truth because we, existing in the kind of being of Dasein, are in the truth. We do not presuppose it as something outside and above us to which we are related along with other values too. We do not presuppose truth, but truth makes it ontologically possible that we can be in such a way that we presuppose something. Truth first makes possible something like presupposition. What does presupposing mean? To understand something as the ground of the being of another being. Right? So if the thinking now occurring doesn't presuppose, then in Heidegger's terms, it doesn't understand something as the ground of the being, of another being. And what could that possibly mean? It could possibly mean that in the thinking now occurring, being is, to be, is, I could say, I can put it with the D or not, is to relate or it is to be related, right? So being is relation in the thinking now occurring. I want to say thoroughly or absolutely. Being is, that would be right. Being is absolute relation, okay? So, the reason I'm focusing on this at the moment is that if there's no presupposing, then in Heideggerian terms, that would be that there would be no situation in which something were the ground of the being of another being, and therefore the otherness, the absolute otherness or the absolute particularity of the thinking now occurring, is elsewhere and elsewise described as an absolute relativity. Okay. Where I could substitute for absolute relativity, absolute beingness. So, the solus ipse, which is that which occurs in the context of angst, which occurs in the context of being toward death, being toward the end, where death is the possibility, the possibility of non-relationally. Of being non-relationally, so one way of distinguishing Heidegger from thinking now occurring is that in Heidegger there continues to be a distinction between being and being related. Minimally, the being of Dasein is potentially or possibly not being related. You see? So I have that distinction between being and being related. And as I approach, now I'm speaking in kind of intensification, as I approach through angst and through the call of conscience to that isolating, individuating in the sense of singularizing, solus ipsis making of the Dasein that I am, all right, as I authentically relate to my end, okay? That solus ipse is my being not related. All right? It's so. In the thinking now occurring, there is no possibility of being related in the negative. Maybe that might even be a redundant statement. There is no. Let me go more slowly. There's no being related in the negative. There's no non-relatedness. There's no non-relatedness. That's about it. Yeah. So, huh?
In the thinking now occurring. Yeah.
Yes, and therefore therefore when I say we're already dead, it's not an alternative to being alive. And in fact, he says he can't deal with the question of whether there's life after death. But in the thinking now occurring, there's nothing but life after death. Right? I don't mean that quite literally, but I think it could pass muster. That is to say, the identity of life and death. Right? For the first time. It would be something of the consciousness of the thinking now occurring.
I don't understand how Dasein could not be related, even in the solus ipse.
Oh. Well, that's the definition of death. Where is that?
Death is a possibility of being that Dasein always has to take upon itself.
What page?
Existential project of an authentic being toward death.
What page?
But it starts actually earlier.
Yeah, it's earlier here.
On
Oh, here it is, 232.
232.
Yeah,
sorry.
232.
Death is a possibility of being that Dasein always has to take upon itself. With death, Dasein stands before itself in its own most potentiality of being.
Yeah, okay, but you have to go further. In this possibility, Dasein is concerned about its being in the world absolutely. Its death is the possibility
Where
of
are
no
you?
longer
Where are
being
you?
able.
232,
In
third
the middle,
paragraph.
okay.
Well,
Sorry.
both the middle of the page.
Yeah, right. I'm in that
Got it.
middle long paragraph. I'm around the third or fourth line. Its death is the possibility of no longer being able to be there. When Dasein is immanent to itself as this possibility, it is completely thrown back upon its own most potentiality of being. Thus, immanent to itself, all relations to other Dasein are dissolved in it. That's what I was pointing to with the ipse, solus ipse, right? So let's read it more slowly. When Dasein is immanent to itself as this possibility. All right, so the possibility, maybe this is what your objection or question, as long as it is, it's related to other beings, which I think is probably the thrust of your,
Yes,
what
that's
you were
right.
saying?
Yeah, simply, yes.
Okay, but
Right.
to be authentically is to be related to the possibility, which, by the way, cannot be bypassed, of its non-relational, non-relational possibility. Let's get his own language here. Thus, immanent to itself, all relations to other Dasein are dissolved in it. This non-relational ownmost possibility is at the same time the most extreme one. As a potentiality of being, Dasein is unable to bypass the possibility of death. Death is the possibility of the absolute impossibility of Dasein. Okay? Thus, death reveals itself as the ownmost non-relational possibility not to be bypassed. As such, it is an eminent immanence. Its existential possibility is grounded in the fact that Dasein is essentially disclosed to itself in the way of being ahead of itself. The structural factor of care has its most primordial concretion in being toward death. Now, he does say elsewhere that death, understood here properly, is not an event. All right. So death is really this is the possibility. It's the kind of the possibility that is constitutional, intrinsically built into, so to speak, being there. All right. It's a real possibility, and it's a possibility that is not to be bypassed. Right. But if I focus on what death is going to mean, it's going to be my own most possibility of not being related, right? Not own most non-relational possibility. So I don't know. Does that cover your?
It's not. I'm not clear about it, but
Well,
I'll let it simmer.
Well, let me try and say what I think is the clear way of understanding it, so that the not being related is a real possibility. And it's constitutional to Dasein. And it's part of the constitutional structure in terms of which Dasein is I want to say able to hear the call of conscience, able to be recalled from its flight from itself. And since we're not dealing here with the everyday they understanding of death, then it has a positive, ontological, existential, AL meaning to say that death is this possibility of my almost non-relational possibility. In other words, it's he distinguishes it from my demise. Right? So as Dasein, I really can't say he says that I perish. living things in general perish, right? But Dasein undergoes it. I don't know what good English here. It undergoes demise. It's demised or it demises. But insofar as it does that, insofar as I understand death as demise, I'm still not understanding it as this primordial constitutive structure of the uncanniness of being in the world. And so in that primordial dimension, I mean, that's all I have to say, really. That's what I want to get at. In other words, I think the temptation is that we expect more, right? But as soon as we expect more, we're thrown back into that world of objective presence, right? So, in other words, we can't get out of, right? The real death for Dasein is precisely the possibility of not being related, which is mine, and which, as mine, and as that possibility of not being related, is already the experience of the solitude, the singleness of the Dasein. And he said earlier on, he spoke of, I can't remember what the subject of the sentence would have been, but he spoke of the individualizing of Dasein, just say, and Dasein is, and again, this is a kind of analog to Kierkegaard, right? Only now generalized. Maybe that would be a way of putting it. Relative, I'm not sure the best term, but he's generalized the singularity, the Kierkegaardian singularity. He's made it. He's explaining it in terms of the primordial ontological structure of Dasein. Yeah.
So Dasein is being in the world.
Right.
If we understand that being in the world, it means that Dasein is always falling away from itself. It's always kind of thrown.
Well, it's at least initially and for the most part. I don't know whether always might be an overstatement.
Yeah, okay, initially and for the most part. Okay, falling away from itself.
In flight from itself.
In flight from itself. And if we understand that in flight from itself, it will ultimately, or it will lead us to being towards death.
Well, if we understand, as it were, for want of a better term, the motivation, in other words, what's going on in the flight from itself, it's a flight from its being authentically, and to be authentically is to be toward death.
Okay.
Right? So I can, as it were, forget, I can be oblivious
I'm tranquilized.
Of the non-bypassable, right, tranquilized, and he has a few other verbs there. Fact that the very constitution of my being in the world is, in some sense, the possibility of my being not related. The possibility of my being in the world is my possibility of not being in the world, of not being there. In fact, I think he actually said, I remember I told you about my friend there, her really serious terror of dying as not being here, she said, right? And he says, I think he says that just straight out today, if we can find it.
So really to be Dasein, really to be here, is to
it's
possibly not be here.
Well, so in that sense, what you said earlier is true. I don't think it's true in the same sense as it is in the thinking now occurring, but yes, it is true that in some sense Heidegger is saying, in some sense, okay, maybe he's saying, as opposed to the thinking now occurring says we're dead. He's saying we're dying. It's that kind of difference. And we're dying in our very being, to say, and the Hegelian version of that is that the very being of finite things, Hegel would tell you, is temporality, by which Hegel means, the temporality of the finite things is their nothingness, is their coming to be and passing away. You see? Okay, so he's taken that, the nothingness of finitude, the temporality of finitude, right? And without contrasting it with some sort of internal actuality, quite absolutely without doing that, never even getting to that, do you see? Because that's going too fast. Let's talk about what is this temporality that Dasein is? What is this finite being that we can, the structure of which we can explore ontologically and existentially without any reference to the determinations of a metaphysical consciousness?
Yeah, I think I understand what my problem was, which is I was linking the sense of Dasein being in the world as being similar to being towards death, in the sense of the thrownness and the flight almost mirroring or resonating with or similar to the being towards death, in that sense of dying or movement away from. So I didn't see there being an extreme difference between non-relational death and being in the world. They both to me were feeling relational, but I think I now see that the flight away from itself is away from the being towards death. The flight into the they is not being towards death.
Yes, and I think,
but
not to complicate this, but I think if I'm hearing you right, I would say, well, you weren't entirely wrong the first time around, because the flight, Dasein's flight from itself, is its but it's a flight from being in the world. In other words, Dasein would, this is a gross way of putting it, Dasein would love to be a thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? It would love not to have any problems. But it's not the set of all the problems we have. You see, what he's saying is all the problems we have. You know, how do we make a living? How do we get ahead? You know, how do we become famous? Whatever your ambition is, all those problems you have, these are all the ways you're covering over the real problem. Right? In other words, to be in the world is a problem. It's fundamentally a problem. It is the problem. Right? That's it. Now, what are you going to do about it? Well, we'll find out next time. We're going to be resolute about that, okay? But first we have to understand that all this other stuff is just covering over the fundamentally problematic nature of being here.
Which is relational.
Yeah, but the problem of being... No, but it's not that simple, because if we were simply related, then we'd have the thinking now occurring, and there'd be no problem. But we don't have the thinking now occurring if we're in Heidegger, and so yes, being in the world is being related, and mit Dasein and so forth. It's being with other Daseins and so forth and so on and so on. But it's still a problem, because in that being with others takes the form inauthentically of the they subject being the subject of the Dasein that I am, instead of my being that subject authentically as the solus ipse, which means that even though I'm here with these others, I have to understand that the real possibility of my being, which I cannot avoid because it's built into the situation in which I find myself in my thrownness, is the possibility of my non-relational possibility. Okay.
Good.
All right.
Sorry.
No, thank you.
No, I mean that. Okay. Okay. Oh, there's where he said. In fact, it's on 232. If I can just, I'd love to pick it out. I think he actually phrases it this way. Maybe I don't know whether I got to it or not. It's somewhere on this page. He actually words it like that. I copied it down here. No longer being able to be there. That's a direct quote, but I don't see it offhand.
It's just in that third new paragraph, about 5 lines down.
From the top?
Death is a possibility is the beginning of the paragraph.
Oh, yeah. No, yeah, I already read it. Yeah, no longer being able to be there, right? It's that possibility.
Yeah.
All right. All right. On page 232, he defines angst as about 4 lines from the bottom of the page. what Angst is about is the potentiality of being of Dasein, absolutely. Right? So I was saying Dasein is problematic. Dasein, the structure of Dasein is, there's a problem, right? The problem is a kind of absolute potentiality of being, right? That's a problem. There's an absolute potentiality of being. And it's interesting to me because when in Novitas Mundi, I actually, somewhere in there, not before I get to Heidegger, I identify absolute potentiality as something of the essence of modern self-consciousness. And here you have Heidegger kind of, again, taking that in a primordial ontological sense.
And Sartre plays in that.
Yeah,
Also.
yeah, okay. All right, 238. This is a somewhat I don't know, there's an existential note. He says on page 238 in the first paragraph beginning on that page, fourth line at the end, the fact that demise is an event that occurs is only empirically certain, in no way decides about the certainty of death. And dropping down about 6 or 7 lines, evading its death, every day being toward the end, is indeed certain of death in another way than it itself would like to realize in purely theoretical considerations. That's another term we should use here. Help, right? It's interesting. So it's, in a certain sense, again, in a more original sense than it's normal in the tradition. I was going to say the tradition distinguishes between theoretical and practical. You could say that what Heidegger is doing is a kind of practical analysis, but again, practical even in a more primordial sense than practical would mean to Kant, because in Kant, practical is going to mean among other things, the moral dimension of human being. So this is a primordial practicality, if you want to call it that. For the most part, everydayness veils this from itself in another way. It does not dare to become transparent to itself in this way. Dropping down another 3 or 4 lines. In this attunement, everydayness acknowledges a higher certainty than the merely empirical one. One knows about the certainty of death, and yet is not really certain about it. The entangled everydayness of Dasein knows about the certainty of death, and yet avoids being certain. But in the light of what it evades, this evasion bears witness phenomenally to the fact that death must be grasped as the own most non-relational, certain possibility not to be bypassed. Right? So he adds to the earlier definition, he adds the notion that it's certain, and if he hasn't done it already, he will also add the notion that it is indefinite. Okay, death is Dasein's own most non-relational possibility. He's already said that, right? Not to be bypassed. Now, it's its own most non-relational, certain possibility not to be bypassed. And he will say, if he hasn't said already, I think he hasn't said it yet, it's indefinite, right? In the sense, and then I think, and this is what led me to this, in an existential sense, is that you could die at any minute. And this reminds me of my friend Jonathan Edwards, right, with the famous little essay that appears in the English books of Sinner in the Hands of an Angry God. The whole thrust of that sermon that was so powerful was, you're only a minute away from hell, and the fact that you're not dead is just the grace of God. So if you're not saved, you better get with it. That was the thrust of the sermon, and in the context, apparently, it was very powerful. But so Heidegger is acknowledging that, right? In other words, and of course we think, well, it's a practical matter. Yeah, of course I could die any minute, right? See, because I'm covering over. But I could. I mean, I really could. Okay. So it's certain that it's certain, but it's indefinite, right? It's not something. And in that sense, by the way, one of the functions of the indefiniteness of it is not something. Therefore, I authentically can postpone. Right? In other words, if dying were an event, I could postpone it by going to the doctor. But if dying is primordially, phenomenologically, not an event for Dasein, I can't postpone it by doing anything. I can't postpone it. You see? Because it's not something that I can move further down the track. Okay. All right, so somewhere on that page he actually says death is possible in every moment.
It's at the last 4 lines on that page on 238.
Yeah. Thus, the they covers over what is peculiar to the certainty of death, that it is possible in every moment. Together with the certainty of death goes the indefiniteness of its when. Every day being toward death evades this indefiniteness by making it something definite. So actually, if you commit a capital crime and get sentenced to death, in some sense, you're let off the hook because you know when, right? That's not true, by the way, but speaking.
Not these days.
That's true.
10 years.
That's right. The doctors won't perform the execution. You're up the creek, right? Okay. But then you have an existential moment, right? Then you can fully appreciate what it means to be there. Okay. Maybe not. Okay. All right. So he's added at this part of the text. He's filled out the definition of death with the notions of indefiniteness and certitude. And on page 243, 242, I guess we could look at that. That's the notion of anticipation. In the first paragraph beginning on 242, but being toward this possibility as being toward death should relate itself to that death so that it reveals itself in this being and for it as possibility. Terminologically, we shall formulate this being toward possibility as anticipation of this possibility. And dropping down about 6 lines, the nearness of being toward death as possibility is as far removed as possible from anything real. The more clearly this possibility is understood, the more purely does understanding penetrate to it as the possibility of the impossibility of existence in general. As possibility, death gives Dasein nothing to be actualized, and nothing which it itself could be as something real. It is the possibility of the impossibility of every mode of behavior toward, of every way of existing. In running ahead to this possibility, it becomes greater and greater. That is, it reveals itself as something which knows no measure at all, no more or less, but means the possibility of the measureless impossibility of existence. Essentially, this possibility offers no support for becoming intent on something, for spelling out the real thing that is possible and so forgetting its possibility. As anticipation of possibility being toward death first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as possibility. Being toward death is the anticipation of a potentiality of being, of that being whose kind of being is anticipation itself. All right, so he says, in the anticipatory revealing of this potentiality of being, Dasein discloses itself to itself with regard to its most extreme possibility. But to project oneself upon one's own most potentiality of being means to be able to understand oneself in the being of the being thus revealed. To exist. Anticipation shows itself as the possibility of understanding one's own most and extreme potentiality of being, that is, as the possibility of authentic existence. Its ontological constitution must be made visible by setting forth the concrete structure of anticipation of death. And then on page 243 in the second paragraph, the first one beginning on that page, death is the almost possibility of Dasein. Being toward it discloses to Dasein its own most potentiality of being, in which it is concerned about the being of Dasein absolutely. Here the fact can become evident to Dasein that in the eminent possibility of itself, it is torn away from the they, that is, anticipation can always already have torn itself away from the they. The understanding of this ability, however, first reveals its factical lostness in the everydayness of the they's self. The ownmost possibility is non-relational, anticipation lets Dasein. So, see, I think that's the deep continuity with that's what I mean by the selfhood. We're not talking about the Cartesian ego, but the ownmost possibility of Dasein is non-relational. It's solus ipse. Right? It's not being related. That's the possibility. Otherwise known as death. Right? But again, not death as some external event. Right? It's the it's the death structure of Dasein. Right? The absolute possibility of the impossibility of existence, something to that effect.
Does it not speak to the death of selfhood?
Well, that's interesting you say that, but Dasein, well, okay, it depends what we mean by that. It speaks to the death of the self as, how is he phrasing it? I would say, if, I don't know, well, I can't be sure what you mean, but I think if I'm following your thrust of your question, when he says in the middle of the page previous, 242, when he speaks of in italics there, of the possibility of the impossibility of existence in general, right? The possibility of the impossibility of existence in general, that would be the death of selfhood. But selfhood, right, is existence in general. I mean, in other words, it's not like a death of selfhood, we move on to something else. Do you see what I'm saying? So yeah, the death of selfhood, when there's nothing but self, in my experience, okay? In other words, there's nothing but me, right? And by the way, the closer I get, I'm saying intense in the authenticity of my being toward death, the more isolated I become, the more myself I become, non-relationally myself, not lost in the they, in the others, I would say in the language of the thinking now occurring, not lost in the others, but when I become myself, I become more and more intensively isolated, okay? And in that intense isolation, I am confronting the possibility of the impossibility of myself, which is not to be bypassed. Now, again, I think there's a certain, because we're not in the realm of the ontic, we're not in the everyday realm here, you just have to rest content with that, so to speak. I want to say content. I'm not sure content is the right word, but you have to rest with that. You have to stay with that. You have to stay with that as the ultimate structure of your being authentically Dasein, and understand that, which in a certain way, therefore, has no solution. Right? There's no answer to that. And of course, if we're really talking about the possibility of the impossibility of existence in general, and that means the possibility of the impossibility of the very self that I am in my most authentic being, that's not going to go away. But if I understand that, then I have the possibility of existing authentically, and that's about. I want to say that's about it, because we have no concept here of an afterlife, or we're not doing theology here. So we're talking about what is our actual, as it were, immediate experience of being in the world.
But if there was to be a Heideggerian heaven, it would have to be motion in that heaven.
Well, I'm inclined to say yes, but why do you?
Well, because otherwise you would have no possibilities.
Yeah, if there were, but I think the whole point is, I mean, he's so insistent. This is why every time Altizer says that Nietzsche is very theological and Heidegger is very deeply theological and so forth, I understand why he says that, and there's certain truth in that, because we have been tracing, so to speak, the impact of, let's say, Kierkegaard on Heidegger, but Heidegger has I don't mean this literally, rationalized, he has understood Kierkegaard in an existential way, in the Heideggerian meaning of existential. So it's true that he has undermined theology. But Heidegger insists over and over again that he's not doing theology, even though all the theologians want to take him on board, right? Including my friend Altai, so that's what I'm going to so he's not really doing theology. So he's not, we really shouldn't bring up a Heideggerian heaven. That's the point.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. All right.
That's the possibility.
No, you see that. No. Because what we're dealing with here is the possibility of the impossibility of existence in general. So
I'm going beyond that.
right. Okay. There's no possibility of the.
I got it.
Okay. All right. So in the middle of page 243, again, that middle paragraph, the almost possibility is non-relational. Anticipation lets Dasein understand that it has to be taken over solely from itself. Has to take over solely from itself the potentiality of being in which it is concerned absolutely about its own most being. Just focus on the word absolutely there, which goes to the point I was trying to make before, which I think I made. In other words, when I say you gotta, this is where you gotta stay, so to speak, right? If you're going to exist authentically. So the key word, absolutely. You're concerned absolutely. Dasein is concerned absolutely of his own most being. It's absolutely so. In other words, there's no relative satisfaction of it. To think that there's a relative satisfaction of this is to be lost, right? Is to be oblivious of one's authentic being. Death does not just belong in an undifferentiated way to one's own Dasein, but it lays claim on it as something individual, and that's wer einzelt, I guess. The non-relational character of death, understood in anticipation, individualizes Dasein down to itself. Okay. Without, just to rehearse a little bit, without not only